Hi, this is NextGen Picks. If you spent more than 5 minutes looking for a TV this month, your feed is probably flooded with thumbnails of reviewers pointing at a glowing rectangle, screaming about how a $900 mini LED just destroyed OLED. I almost bought into it myself. The numbers look unbelievable on paper. 3,000 nits of brightness, thousands of individual dimming zones. But here's what nobody is talking about when they test these in perfectly dark, climate-controlled studios. What actually happens when you put one in a normal sunlit living room and feed it a compressed cable signal? I spent the last few weeks running the top $900 models from Hisense, TCL, and Sony. And man, the showroom illusion breaks fast. You're not just buying a bright display, you're buying into a processing engine. And some of these are actively ruining your movies with aggressive software bugs. Before you drop nearly $1,000 on a spec sheet, hit subscribe NextGen Picks if you appreciate independent testing that buys retail units off the shelf. We need to talk about the panel lottery you're blindly walking into. Let's tear these things apart. So let's zoom out for a second and look at how we got here. 5 years ago, if you had $1,000 for a TV, you bought a mid-range edge-lit LCD and you just accepted that the letterbox bars on your movies were going to look milky gray. Then, the manufacturing lines in Shenzhen figured out how to mass-produce mini LED arrays cheaply. They shrunk the diodes down so they could pack thousands of them behind the LCD layer. Suddenly, brands are pushing 2,500 nits of peak brightness and claiming they can perfectly shut off zones to simulate true black. It sounds incredible on the spec sheet, but they missed a massive engineering bottleneck. The problem isn't the microscopic lights themselves. The problem is the silicon telling those lights what to do. When you feed a 65-in mini LED, a pristine uncompressed 4K HDR Blu-ray signal, it looks flawless. The processor knows exactly which dimming zones to fire. But that is not how you actually watch TV in your house. You watch heavily compressed bitrate-starved Hulu feeds or standard 1080p cable sports. That changes everything. Because when a budget television processor has to artificially upscale a muddy 720p basketball broadcast, while simultaneously calculating exactly how much voltage to send to 2,000 individual light clusters in real time, the entire system chokes. You end up with a blurry, stuttering mess. I didn't expect this processor gap to be so obvious, but it is the defining flaw of this entire price bracket, which brings me to the Hisense U8N, the absolute poster child for this exact problem. On paper, it is a monster. I clocked the 65-in model pushing just over 2,800 nits in a 10% HDR window during my testing. That is literally bright enough to make you physically squint if you're watching in a dark room. Actually, wait. Let me reframe that, because bright doesn't capture the physical reality of this hardware. When I had this unit on my test bench for 2 weeks running continuous HDR stress tests, the amount of heat radiating off the rear chassis was genuinely surprising. You were essentially hanging a flat space heater on your wall. It gets worse. I took a thermal camera to the back plastic casing after 40 minutes of running Dune Part 2, and the exhaust vents were hitting 108 degrees Fahrenheit, which explains exactly why so many of these budget heavyweights end up with dead T-Con boards right outside the warranty window. Over 3 or 4 years of thermal cycling, heating up, cooling down, those internal capacitors just bake themselves to death. The marketing team loves throwing the phrase 144 Hz PC gaming on the box in giant neon letters to bait the spec chasers. They completely ignore how the television handles basic daily navigation. The UI lag is a persistent daily annoyance. You hit the volume button, and the on-screen indicator shows up almost a full second later. You try to open the Disney Plus app, and the Google TV interface stutters like a 5-year-old tablet. But the bigger issue is how Hisense handles color accuracy, specifically the EOTF tracking. EOTF is the map the TV uses to decide how bright a specific scene should be. Out of the box, the U8N completely ignores the director's intent. It artificially over-brightens the midtones just to make the picture look punchy in a brightly lit showroom. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, didn't you just say maximum brightness was the whole point of buying this? I know, that sounds like I'm contradicting myself. Hear me out. Bright highlights, like a flashlight or an explosion, should be blinding, but the shadows in the corner of the room shouldn't be lifted up to look like a cloudy afternoon. When everything is bright, nothing actually stands out, and the image loses all its depth. This ruins horror movies. If you try watching something poorly lit and heavily compressed, the slow local dimming algorithm leaves massive glowing halos around moving objects because the MediaTek Pentonic chip simply cannot calculate the lighting transitions fast enough to keep up with the action on screen. You end up turning down the backlight anyway just to save your retinas and hide the blooming. We need to discuss the panel lottery, because this is where the $900 price tag shows its true colors. To hit that price, manufacturers accept incredibly wide manufacturing tolerances. They buy the B-grade panels. When you run a 50% gray uniformity test on the U8N, you will almost always see dirty screen effect. These are faint, permanent vertical bands that look like someone wiped the inside of your screen with a greasy rag. You won't notice it during a brightly lit Marvel movie, but the second you watch a hockey game and the camera pans horizontally across the wide ice, those dirty bands stay perfectly still while the image moves behind them. It drives me absolutely insane. I spent way too long testing this. My family has concerns about my sanity, mostly because I spent a full Saturday staring at a gray screen trying to measure the exact millimeter width of these defects. And this is where I'm going to make a lot of enemies in the AV forums. I actually think you should go into the settings of these Hisense mini LEDs and drop the local dimming from high down to medium. Yes, you lose the absolute inkiest OLED blacks, but the processor suddenly stops panicking. The comet trails behind fast-moving bright objects disappear. You trade a 5% drop in contrast for a 40% cleaner motion resolution. Half of you reading the spec sheets will probably disagree with me on this. Drop a comment below. Do you leave your local dimming maxed out, or do you dial it back to fix the blooming? I want to know where the consensus actually is right now. I'll give Hisense credit for one thing though, the anti-reflective. Coating on the U8N is significantly better than last year's model. If you have a massive sliding glass door directly opposite your couch, this TV will punch right through the glare. It solves a very specific physical room problem perfectly. I almost didn't include this part, but it actually matters more than I expected for daytime viewing. Speaking of solving problems, I'm putting together the roster for next month's teardowns. What specific category is driving you crazy right now? Soundbars, mesh routers? Let me know what you want tested next. Fast forward 6 months into ownership, and you start noticing the things you can't fix with a settings tweak. We need to look at what happens when a manufacturer decides to focus entirely on the panel and completely forgets about the software keeping it alive. So, if Hisense is giving you a raw engine that runs at 108 degrees, remember that thermal scan from a minute ago? TCL approaches the exact same problem from a slightly different angle. With the 65-in QM851G, they manufacture their own panels through CSOT, which gives them a tighter grip on the supply chain. You get slightly better uniformity out of the box, but they still fall into the exact same processing trap. Let me back up, because I don't want to completely dismiss what TCL achieved here. When I tested the QM851G in a pitch-black room playing the opening space sequence of Gravity, the black levels were genuinely startling. It approaches OLED level contrast. The dimming algorithm completely shuts off the zones behind the stars, leaving almost no glowing halos around the bright white text. It is visually stunning, but the second you transition from a dark space scene to a brightly lit daylight shot, the QM851G's aggressive backlight control completely blows out the color accuracy, pushing skin tones into a weird saturated plastic territory that requires 30 minutes of frustrating menu diving just to look remotely human. If you're already reaching for your phone to check the price on Amazon, hold on. You need to understand the software tax you are paying here. TCL and Hisense both use Google TV, but they load it with so much background processing and telemetry that by month 8 of daily use, you will be waiting 3 seconds for the volume bar to appear on screen. I tested this side by side with an NVIDIA Shield connected to the same HDMI port. The difference in interface speed is embarrassing. When I had the QM851G set up in my living room, the native app for Peacock kept crashing during live sports until I manually hard rebooted the television by unplugging the physical power cord from the wall. That gets old fast. If you are dropping $900 on a home theater centerpiece, you shouldn't have to restart it like a freezing Windows 95 desktop computer every third weekend just to finish watching a Sunday night football game. Zoom out for a second. And let's talk about audio, because this is where the budget boards actively ruin your living room experience. The TCL QM851G and Hisense U8N both claim HDMI 2.1 EARC support. This is supposed to let you plug in a premium soundbar and never think about it again. The physical reality of that connection is wildly different. I ran a Sonos ARC into the TCL for a week. Every 45 minutes, the audio would randomly drop out for 2 seconds. The internal board literally loses the digital handshake with the soundbar, and you end up having to power cycle the television just to get the dialogue back in sync with the actor's lips. This is unacceptable. When you are trying to watch a quiet, tense dialogue scene, having the audio completely cut out because the television's internal processor is overwhelmed by a basic data handshake completely destroys the immersion of the movie. Now, here's where it gets weird. You can completely avoid all of that software friction and audio handshake instability, but you have to accept a massive downgrade in raw hardware numbers. Enter the 55 in Sony Bravia 7. On paper, the Sony looks like a complete ripoff. It has fewer dimming zones than the TCL. It doesn't get nearly as bright in a 10% HDR window, and the off-axis viewing angles are notoriously bad. If you sit more than 30° off-center on your couch, the colors wash out and the blooming around subtitles becomes aggressively visible. Specs lie. The XR processor is the only chip in this entire price bracket that can take a heavily compressed, muddy 720p cable broadcast and actually clean up the macro blocking artifacts around the players without blurring the entire field. I completely wrote this model off before I tested it. I looked at the spec sheet and assumed Sony was just lazily taxing buyers for the logo. I was wrong. The image processing is so far ahead of MediaTek that it makes the Hisense look like a toy. That spec sheet reads like a dating profile. Impressive until you meet it in person. This matters because you are essentially paying a premium for invisible software stabilization. It makes 80% of your actual daily viewing, cable TV, YouTube, and standard streaming look significantly better. When you feed it garbage signal, the Bravia 7 rebuilds it, but you do sacrifice physical space because the chassis stays out 4 in from your wall even on a flush mount. It just works. And this is the part that genuinely frustrates me about Samsung's strategy right now, because their 55-in QA900D sits right in this same price bracket at around $990, but they actively sabotage their own hardware with stubborn corporate decisions. I know half of you will disagree and say the Tizen operating system is fine, but Samsung's refusal to support Dolby Vision in 2026 is an absolute deal-breaker for movie fans. They refuse to pay the licensing fee. If you have a massive library of 4K Voodoo movies encoded in Dolby Vision, the QN900D drops back to base HDR10. It completely ignores the dynamic metadata that tells the TV exactly how to map the brightness of every single frame. You are spending $1,000 on a piece of premium hardware only to be locked out of the industry-standard high dynamic range format just because two massive corporations are having a licensing tantrum over pennies. It feels incredibly petty. I know some of you strictly play Xbox and don't care about Dolby Vision encoding. And if that's you, the QN90D handles 144Hz PC gaming flawlessly without breaking a sweat. But for the rest of us, it is a glaring omission. Everything I just said, it almost doesn't matter, because the biggest hidden trade-off in this entire category isn't a missing feature. It's the firmware update trap that hits between month 12 and month 18 of ownership. When manufacturers push out mandatory software updates for these smart TVs, they frequently and silently alter the local dimming algorithms to hide premature backlight aging. This completely ruins the contrast you originally paid for. After tracking user logs on the AVS forums for the last 2 generations of these budget flagship killers, the pattern is undeniable. This is brutal. Month 1, the television looks amazing, but by month 14, an update drops and suddenly the variable refresh rate starts tearing during PlayStation 5 sessions, or the black letterbox bars start glowing slightly gray, and you can never roll back the software. The reality is, well, the ugly reality is that these brands allocate zero engineering budget to maintaining older hardware once the new models hit the shelves. You are buying disposable software wrapped around a decent screen. If you buy any of these displays, immediately disconnect them from the internet after initial setup. Plug in a $40 Roku or an Apple TV to protect yourself from destructive background updates. Relying on the native OS in this price tier feels like a ticking clock. Protect your investment. I'm genuinely curious what you guys do about this, so drop your setup in the comments. Are you using the built-in smart TV apps, or do you strictly use an external device to bypass the entire nightmare? Okay, let's bring this back to your actual living room and figure out who these slabs of glass are actually built for. We have 4 distinct buyer profiles, and if you misidentify which one you fall into, you will absolutely waste $900. I see this happen every single day in the AV subreddits. Someone buys a ridiculously bright panel for a basement theater, and within 2 weeks they are complaining about eye strain and horrible blooming around the movie letterbox bars. You have to match the hardware physics to your exact room environment, or you are going to hate the television. If your couch sits in a room with massive uncovered south-facing windows, your options narrow immediately. You are the prime candidate for the 65 in Hisense U8N. The raw output is your primary defense against glare. When I had the setup in a sun-drenched room facing a sliding glass door, the sheer brute force of the backlight punched right through the ambient light. It completely masked the reflections of the furniture on the screen, but you accept a trade-off. You surrender accurate color tracking, and you accept that the software will eventually become a lagging nightmare. Buy the Sony. That XR processor smooths out the digital noise around the players' helmets without smearing the grass into a blurry green mess, which is something the budget models completely fail to do. If you spend 80% of your time watching Thursday Night Football on Amazon Prime or heavily compressed 720p ESPN broadcasts through a basic cable box, you need processing power over brightness. The Sony Bravia 7 handles this flawlessly. It mathematically rebuilds the missing data. Then there are the spec sheet optimizers. You guys know who you are. You read RTing's reviews like religious texts and refuse to buy anything that doesn't hit a theoretical contrast ratio of at least 100,000 to 1. The TCL QM851G is built entirely for you. After running this through standard SDR color calibration with my colorimeter, the black levels were shockingly deep for an LCD panel. I spent way too long trying to find blooming around white text on a black background. My wife walked into the room, saw me staring at a perfectly blank black screen with a single white dot in the center, and quietly closed the door. She gets it mostly. But that's not even the part I wanted to talk about right now. I need to address the darkroom purist because this is where the entire 900 mini LED category completely falls apart. If your primary viewing habit involves turning off all the lights at 10 at night to watch a moody, atmospheric horror movie, skip this entire bracket. Go find an LG B Series OLED on clearance. The mini LED backlight arrays, no matter how many microscopic dimming zones they brag about on the box, will always leak a faint glow into the dark areas of the screen. Go OLED. Go. When a pixel needs to show black, it completely turns off, resulting in absolute infinite contrast without a single glowing halo spilling into the dark corners of the frame. I know that sounds like a subtle difference until you see it in person, but once your eyes adjust to perfect pixel-level black levels in a dark basement, looking at an artificially dimmed LCD screen feels like a massive downgrade. Now you're probably thinking, wait, didn't you just spend the last 15 minutes complaining about how expensive TVs are getting? I did, and I know it sounds like I'm telling you to spend more money. Let me explain that better. I want you to spend the right money. Buying a $900 TCL that you hate using because the UI lags every time you press volume is a worse financial decision than spending $100 on an entry-level OLED that perfectly matches your viewing environment. You are buying 3 to 5 years of daily interaction. So where do we actually land for the absolute best value? I'm forced to pick one model that delivers the most aggressive hardware for the lowest possible price. The 65-in TCL QM851G wins. At exactly $899 right now, it offers 85% of the visual performance of a flagship television that costs 3 times as much. Yes, the out-of-the-box color accuracy leans toward a weird plasticky blue, and the Google TV interface will eventually slow down. But for the sheer cinematic impact in a mixed lighting room, it dominates the budget tier. I'll take it. You lose 10 in of screen real estate compared to the budget giants, but you gain a television that actually cleans up the compressed garbage signals we watch every single day. The overall winner is different. The best overall award in this exact price bracket has to go to the 55-in Sony Bravia 7. I found several open box models hovering right around the $1,000 mark at local retailers, and the image processing advantage simply cannot be ignored. And this brings up a massive divide in the home theater community. I need you to vote on this down in the comments because reasonable people completely disagree here. Is it a smarter financial move to buy an $899 Hisense every 3 or 4 years, knowing the thermal exhaustion? Remember that 108-degree in heat scan I showed you earlier will eventually fry the internal boards, or do you drop $2,500 on a premium LG flagship and ride it out for 10 years? Tell me your strategy. I genuinely want to know which camp is winning right now. I almost didn't include this part, but it actually matters more than I expected when we talk about longevity. We need to have a serious reality check about the physical lifespan of these sub-$1,000 displays. You are not buying a television that you will pass down to your kids. You are buying a highly disposable, heavily subsidized internet appliance. The brands sell these units at razor-thin margins because they plan to monetize your viewing habits. They scrape your data through automatic content recognition software, capturing screenshots of what you watch to sell to advertisers. They will fail. The internal capacitors are sourced from the lowest bidder to hit that magic retail price, and the power supplies are pushed to the absolute edge of their thermal limits to generate those crazy brightness numbers. They do not care about long-term reliability. The plastic chassis is cheap. When the warranty expires on day 366, you are completely on your own. That is why the good enough threshold is so dangerous. If you drop below $600 for a 65-in screen, you enter the edge-lit LCD graveyard. Those televisions only have lights along the very edges of the screen, guaranteeing horrific grayish blacks and massive cloudy patches in the corners. But hovering right at $900 gives you a false sense of security. It feels like a premium purchase. It looks heavy in the box, but the internal components are essentially ticking clocks waiting for thermal degradation. So, how do you protect yourself? First, stop treating the built-in smart TV interface as a permanent feature. Assume the software will become entirely unusable within 36 months. Budget for a dedicated external streaming box, an Apple TV 4K, or an NVIDIA Shield, and strictly use the television as a dumb monitor. Second, never plug a high-draw mini LED directly into an unprotected wall outlet. A standard power strip will not save the sensitive T-Con board from a voltage spike. You need a dedicated high joule surge protector or an uninterruptible power supply. But it is. I've put together a list of vetted sources in the description below, tracking the models that avoid these specific hardware revision traps, along with the exact surge protectors I use on my own test benches. You have to play defense against the manufacturers here. Buying retail tech shouldn't feel like a gamble. The marketing teams are brilliant at convincing you that a missing spec will ruin your life. They want you terrified of missing out on 144 Hz gaming or 1,000 extra dimming zones. But when you're sitting on your couch on a Tuesday night trying to watch a grainy horror movie, the only thing that actually dictates your happiness is whether the processor can handle the dark shadows without turning the screen into a blocky gray mess. I've stared at these screens until my vision physically blurred. Actually, my optometrist is probably the only person truly winning in this scenario. But after running these TVs through hell, I'm confident that avoiding the Hisense panel lottery and accepting the smaller screen size of the Bravia 7 is the safest long-term play. Or just accept the TCL's quirks and enjoy the massive screen. Just don't say, I didn't warn you about the UI lag. We are done here. But after running these TVs through hell, I am confident that avoiding the Hisense panel lottery and accepting the smaller screen size of the Bravia 7 is the safest long-term play. Check the links below for the safe versions. Hit subscribe NextGen Picks if this saved you a headache. I'll see you in the next one.